Thank you, Anna. Well, friends, I'm going to say a word about the economic calamity of our time and the relevance of economic democracy today. When one has a 15-minute time limit, one does not begin with introductory material or a story or even a prefatory remark like this one. One just jumps right into the deep edge of the pool, and so here we go. The first historic wave of what we've agreed to call economic globalization started in the 1870s, and it faltered in the 1930s. The second historic wave began in the 1980s, and it faltered 2 years ago. Karl Marx, foreseeing the first one, famously predicted, "All that is solid melts into air." Well, that suddenly sounds familiar. But Karl Marx was not warning merely that the stock market might vaporize your pension or your job or your mortgage. His point was that global capitalism commodifies everything it touches, including labor and nature, putting everything up for sale and at risk. Nothing is exempt from the pressure of competition. Social contracts and places of rest have vanished under threats of obsolescence and ruin, while the global market exploits resources, displaces communities, and sets off wealth explosions and wild cycles of boom and bust. Tom Friedman, a celebrant of the second wave, calls it turbo-capitalism. Economic globalization, the integration of national economies into the global economy through direct trade, foreign investment, short-term capital flows, and flows of labor and technology has flattened the world, Friedman says. In a flat world, you either compete successfully or you're run over. In his telling, global capitalism reduces national politics to minor tweaks. There is no third way in political economy anymore. There isn't even a second way. Any nation that wants a growing economy has to wear a one-size-fits-all golden straitjacket that unleashes the private sector, keeps inflation low, minimizes government, eliminates tariffs, deregulates capital markets, and allows direct foreign ownership and investment. Once a nation takes this path, he says, its political choices get reduced to Pepsi or Coke, to slight nuances of taste or policy, tiny alterations to account for local traditions, a little bit of loosening here or there, but never any real deviation from what he calls the core golden rules. Friedman wants the U.S. to spend more on green technology and on science education. He's quite good on environmental issues, especially recently. But he tells his millions of readers to give up on nostalgic dreams of anything resembling social justice. Right up to the meltdown of 2008, he marveled at the wealth-breeding ingenuity of what he called the electronic herd. Well, he certainly had plenty of company, didn't he? Tom Friedman and so many others celebrated. The electronic herd zips capital around the globe with virtually no regard for governments or nations or anything else, taking orders from no one, guided only by economic attractions that they liken to laws of nature. But that overlooked, and it overlooks still, that governments played huge roles in setting up this system, defending it and perpetuating it, deciding whether or not to regulate it, and dealing with its implications for equality, trade agreements, human rights, and the rights of workers, immigration, and the environment. From the perspective of Economics 101, at least the textbook version, every bubble mania is basically alike. But from the beginning, this one has been harder to swallow, because it started with people who were just trying to buy a house of their own, who usually had no concept whatsoever of predatory lending, and who had no say whatsoever in the securitization boondoggle that spliced up various components of risk in order to trade them separately. It seemed like a blessing to get a low-rate mortgage. It was a mystery how the banks did it, but this was their business. You trusted that they knew what they were doing. Your bank resold the mortgage to an aggregator who bunched it up with thousands of other subprime mortgages, chopped the package into pieces, and sold them to corporate parties looking for extra yield. Your mortgage payments paid for the interest on the bonds. For 20 years, securitizations and derivatives were great at concocting extra yield and their chief purpose, allowing the banks to hide their debt. Now the day of reckoning for that illusion is here, with more to come. 2 years from now, speculative corporate debt in this country is going to explode, as the reckoning for high-risk loans, bonds, and leveraged buyouts transacted 5 to 7 years ago will occur. In the bond business, this is called a maturity wall. This year, $25 billion is coming due for junk bonds that were sold before the credit crisis hit in 2007. In 2012, that number will soar to $160 billion. The following year, it will be at least $215 billion. The next year, it's going to be over $350 billion. This coming avalanche of over $750 billion of speculative debt was created just like the mortgage crisis, with CDOs that sliced and diced corporate loans, and all of it is going to come due at a time when the U.S. government itself is going to need to borrow about $2 trillion to bridge its budget deficit and to refinance its existing debt. Another credit crunch is coming, and we still haven't resolved the bank problem that the Obama administration inherited. So many plugged-in players rode this financial lunacy for all it was worth, caught in the terribly real pressure of the market to produce constant short-term gains. Speculators gamed the system and regulators looked the other way. Mortgage brokers made fortunes off mortgages they had no business selling. Bond bundlers made fortunes packing the loans into securities. Rating agencies made fortunes giving inflated bond ratings to the loans, being paid by the very issuers of the bonds they rated. Corporate executives made fortunes putting the bonds on their balance sheets. For a while, there was so much money to be made that firms just couldn't bear to leave it aside for competitors to grab. The banks got leveraged up to 50 to 1, which is where Bear Stearns was at the end, and just kept piling on debt. The mania for extra yield fed on itself, blowing away business ethics and even common sense. Today, the big banks are still holding about $2 trillion of toxic debt. But their bailouts have made them feel better. They don't want to be regulated, and they're back to gambling in the swaps market, which pays so much better than making boring investments in the real economy. The financial reform bill currently at play has some good things in it. It puts most derivative trading on an open exchange, and it proposes not to bail out any more zombie banks or financial institutions. But it's loaded up with carve-outs and exemptions on derivative trading. It houses the new Consumer Protection Agency in the Federal Reserve, which is very friendly to the big banks, and it takes a pass on the biggest problem of all, that the biggest banks are just too big. Today, the 6 largest banks in this country control assets totaling 65% of the nation's gross domestic product. 15 years ago, that figure was 18%. The big banks have grown fantastically large and very rapidly, and now their bailouts have made them even bigger. The popular support is there for a stronger bill, if only the political class was willing to fight for it. Today, the Obama administration is struggling to fill a $2 trillion hole in the economy, even as Wall Street regains its swagger. We need huge investments in green technology, infrastructure rebuilding, high-speed trains, education, and healthcare. Deficit spending in the long run is inflationary, which lends an economic urgency to things we should be doing anyway. Scaling back the U.S. global military empire, which costs over $1 trillion a year, building a clean energy economy, getting control of healthcare costs, and restoring the very principle of progressive taxation. These are typical progressive reforms, however, and I want to suggest something that's more visionary. Building a movement for economic democracy that establishes publicly funded venture capital banks. If we can talk seriously about creating bad banks or aggregator banks to soak up the toxic debt of the big banks, we ought to be able to talk about creating publicly financed good banks to do good things. Public banks could finance startups in green technology that are currently languishing. They could provide financing for cooperatives that traditional banks spurn. They could be financed by an economic stimulus package, the next one, or by claiming the good assets of banks seized by the government, or both.